can see everything okay?
Yes, we can see everything. Yes.
Brilliant, thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Kat Williams and I'm from the School of Law and Politics at Cardiff University, and I'm here today to talk to you about the alternative for Germany, right-wing extremism and deflecting the blame. So before I get into my presentation proper, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of my thesis title and my research questions, because ostensibly my research doesn't centre on disinformation as such, though it does have a role, which I'll explain in a little while. So my current working title is Assessing the Role and Motivation of Women in the Alternative for Germany, the AFD. And I ask, why do women join the AFD? To what extent does gender play a role in women's recruitment to the AFD? Is this the same for male peers? What does the AFD offer members that the mainstream German parties can't? What issues are most important to those joining the party? And how do members reconcile party politics with their own lives and experiences? And that's a really central question to my thesis overall. So subject agency is a central theme explored in my thesis, and I attempt to unpack how AFD members navigate this agency in different ways, whether that's within the party itself in the eyes of peers or through self-representation in interviews or media accounts or tweets or blogs, things like that. I use a feminist post-structuralist epistemological approach, which is beneficial in three key ways in this context. Firstly, it centres women in particular as research subjects in their own right. Gender is used to interrogate dominant discourses surrounding women's political subjectivity and their engagement with far-right ideology and discourse. And lastly, it recognises that research subjects are important political actors whose engagement in the social world has broader implications. So, pulling this all together, I use Foucauldian discourse analysis to embed subjects in wider social, cultural, political and economic contexts in order to answer my research questions. It asks important questions about the relationship between discourse and what individuals think and feel, what they do, and the contextual factors that make this thinking and feeling possible. And I had a period of fieldwork in Germany back in 2019 where I conducted semi-structured interviews with members of the AFD, and I also use documentary analysis of materials, some listed on the screen there, to attempt to get an idea of the factors that have motivated AFD members, as well as unpack the often contradictory intersections of gender, race and class. And in my thesis, I talk about three key themes in depth, and they are related to Islam and immigration, gender and national identity. So for the purposes of this paper, I wanted to discuss some of my findings in relation to the theme of Islam and how, in the face of the party's own well-documented links to right-wing extremism, some AFD members attempt to rationalise their party engagement by deflecting attention away from this association, instead scapegoating immigrants, Muslims and left-wing opponents. So before we move on, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the party's beginnings, its evolution and its increasing association with right-wing extremism. So Penny Bocken refers to this as the AFD's cumulative radicalisation. On paper, it began life as a Eurosceptic party, but with each successive leader, the party's stance on a range of issues relating to Islam, the traditional family, gender roles, LGBTQ+ rights, to name but a few, have been framed in increasingly nationalistic terms. And following the fall of the first leader, the party actually went through a bit of a crisis and it lost a fifth of its membership. But the Syrian refugee crisis in 2015 revived its fortunes, and then the party went on more of a rightwards trajectory. Those members, or excuse me, I've just lost my place in my notes. Those members of the AFD, elected representatives with alleged Nazi sympathies, such as Thuringia regional leader Björn Höcke, have survived numerous attempts to kick them out of the party. And the links between the AFD and right-wing extremists have come to prominence in recent years, following the proposed observation and eventual disbandment of Der Flügel, or the Wing, which was a nationalist faction within the AFD. And it was announced earlier this year that the AFD as a whole would be formally observed by the German security services, though the party have since lodged an appeal against that in the courts. It's kind of really important to point out in the German context that groups or individuals who are seen as hostile or verfassungsfeindlich to the German constitution can be put under a period of observation by the Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, or the BVV, and if they're found to have links to extremism of any form, they can be banned. But it's kind of similar to how the Home Office prescribes banned groups in the UK, but it's a bit more of a protracted process where they gather evidence, bug phones, that kind of thing, to see if those links are there. And as I said, the AFD are challenging this ruling in court as we speak. So using Foucauldian discourse analysis, we can identify the subject positions made available within a particular discourse. And these positions identify a location for persons within the structure of rights and duties for those who use the specific repertoire. And in discursive terms, the AFD and some of its members construct and demarcate subject positions for specific groups or individuals who, in their eyes, pose an existential threat to the well-being, safety, or security of the people. And these threats typically emanate from outgroups such as immigrants, but can also include others closer to home, such as left-wing opponents, the media, or other political parties. It is, according to the AFD's co-parliamentary leader, Alice Weidel, the alleged violent propensity of immigrants that has allegedly increased the risk of Islamist terrorism in Germany. And as the extracts on the slide demonstrate, not only are immigrants regarded as rapists and liars by some AFD members, but are predisposed and thus seemingly inevitable terror threats. So in a plenary session in the Bundestag, the AFD say the burqa and the niqab are but a uniform of Salafism and Islamism. And there's some sensationalist headlines here regarding sexual assaults in shisha bars. Alice Weidel, in her book, says that without the immigrants that came to Germany in 2015, less women would have been harassed or sexually assaulted. And one of my interviewees, Ingrid, she says, a lot of them lie. They destroyed their passports, so we don't know who is here and we can't get rid of them anymore. So despite the fact that many of the AFD's claims surrounding immigration or Muslims are routinely debunked by academics or media commentators, the party have managed to commandeer mainstream narratives on the topic through their deliberate policy of Tabubrech, which means taboo breaking. In 2016, a leaked memo revealed that the AFD was encouraging its members to be deliberately provocative in order to stay in the headlines. And overall, these relations of power then operate through rules of discourse, and they sanction and prohibit ways of thinking and being in the world and entrench social norms. Consequently, anti-Muslim and anti-immigration discourse in this context is consolidated and reinforced, but is also upheld and legitimized through the discourse itself, and it becomes more and more difficult to challenge. And this is something Elstein refers to as standard repetition. Certain discourses are so dominant that new observations lack the force to change public opinion about a topic. And the perceived lack of political leadership relating to the 2015 refugee crisis has provoked fear and resentment of immigrants, and this has been relentlessly exploited by the AFD and other parties like it. So unsurprisingly, the idea that interviewees support violence, structural or otherwise, through their association with the party is routinely rejected. And despite their neat categorization of their perceived existential enemies, they are unable or perhaps unwilling to critically reflect upon how party rhetoric contributes to political polarization, the erosion of community cohesion, or the party's alleged influence on right-wing extremists. So when I was in the field, I asked interviewees what they thought about being labelled as right-wing extremist, and these are some of the responses. Gabby says this is absolutely unacceptable and an absolute cheek. Petra says it's completely made up out of thin air. No one can accuse the AFD of any militant activities. What shocked me is that it's seriously accepted in public discussion. Antifa, as they call themselves, are actually fascists, red fascists. And Anka says that just because the old parties don't agree with the AFD's arguments, they bring out the Nazi cudgel, which she claims always works in Germany for political opponents. Here we can see some interviewee responses to questions regarding the perpetrators of a number of attacks proven to have been committed by right-wing extremists. So I asked Inga about her thoughts on whether Germany has a right-wing extremism problem, and there have been several incidences. So in 2019, there was a shooting at a synagogue in Halle, and then the year previously, in 2018, there were some anti-immigrant riots. And she says, we have a problem with right-wing extremism, but it's not the main problem. The main problem is Islamism. Right-wing extremism is so exaggerated. I'll tell you why. It's all hatred and agitation against the AFD. Furthermore, when referring back to the case of the synagogue shooting in Halle, she says right-wing extremism didn't kill anyone. He was a left-wing economist. He killed 2 innocent people. I thought it was bad, but it wasn't a right-wing extremist who did it. And then in regard to the riots in Chemnitz in 2018, which happened after a Cuban-German man was killed by 2 asylum seekers, and the far right used that as an opportunity to mobilize and then protest against immigration. And Elsa claims that in response to this, the left organized celebratory concerts, celebrated the death of the person. I was disgusted. It's not in our culture that you celebrate when someone dies, but that you mourn. There are cultures in the world where people sing and dance when someone dies, but not in Germany, which is a quite bizarre statement to make. And in an interview with Ingrid, we talk about problematic party members and what the party is allegedly doing to ensure that links to right-wing extremism aren't being made. So I say the youth organization Junge Alternative faced monitoring by the BVV, and I ask her what the party is doing to ensure that these links aren't being maintained. And she says, we have some guys in the party, they are the minority, but they're pretty loud. And if they say things like, what are they doing? So I say, that's not party policy. Not party policy. And if Mr. Hocker, AfD leader in Thuringia, says something and everyone says, oh my God, you can be sure I was ripping out my hair. And that's the majority of the party. So these problematic figures are laughed off, or their actions are seen as inconsequential faux pas, as if they're just eccentricities rather than a deeper systemic issue. So very quickly, before I conclude, in contrast to Inga's statement that right-wing extremism is over-exaggerated in Germany, in a 2009 report, the BVV estimated that there are over 32,200 right-wing extremists currently active in Germany, and this figure includes groups associated with the AFD, such as Der Flügel or Junge Alternative. And I just wanted to give you a very quick overview of some of the more high-profile attacks that have taken place since reunification in 1990, and this is by no means an extensive list, but we have various shootings, most recently at 2 shisha bars in Hanau. We have the murder of a pro-refugee politician, the anti-immigrant riots, mass shootings, vigilante attacks, a secret neo-Nazi cell who went on a rampage for 11 years, and some arson attacks on refugee homes in Solingen back in 1993. So just to wrap up, so a feminist and indeed a Foucauldian approach recognises that knowledge itself is historically contingent and located within particular social, cultural, political and historical discourses. But sometimes subject testimonies can be hard to reconcile. Elsa's bizarre claim that the left celebrated the death of the person killed in Chemnitz, or Inga's claim that the Halle synagogue attacker was a left-wing economist, whatever that means. In this way, they appear to rationalise their engagement with the party by distorting media narratives to paint themselves and the party in a more positive light. They position themselves as the victims of disinformation rather than the propagators. So what does this tell us about their political subjectivity in this context? How the subjects reassess their self-interest to correspond with group interests? There's a lot of food for thought. As Gerald Mack and Can point out, we must be careful, however, not to assume a consistency between attitudes and actions. So in other words, what people say and then what they go on to do can be very different things. Is it in fact the case that subjects selectively disregard problematic elements of party life while enjoying other benefits? And these are all questions I hope to answer in my thesis. So finally, my last part now. While it is clear that the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis represents one moment in time and one salient motivating factor for some of the AFD members I interviewed, there's a lot more to unpack in regard to the deeper issues of national identity and historical memory. And my next chapter, As Yet Unwritten, will explore how these issues play a crucial role in facilitating members' engagement with the AFD, particularly for those who may have grown up in the former German Democratic Republic or East Germany. And that's it. Thanks very much for listening.